been a little while since I've done a top 100, and that one was for the games that I consider the very worst. So today's one should be a bit different. It should be something very close to my heart. The arcade. The arcade, especially throughout the 90s, from the beginning to the end, was a big part of my life. I did a lot of growing up in them, I played an awful lot of them, and I had all different kinds of fun, whether as a bright-eyed little turd or as a teenager. I've been meaning to do an arcade list for quite some time and, well, at last it's here. The 100 games that, at least for now, represent the best of the arcade, at least for the period that I'm comfortable with. These are all kind of old after all. The latest game here is from 2004, and it's a bit of an outlier. But there's a good mix of everything from late 90s 3D technical fests to simpler Golden Age classics, and naturally there's a lot of memories and sentimental things going on, so don't forget that. I didn't really try to put these games together based on things like technical power or their general importance or anything like that. They're my games, and it's loosely based on my experience. I have no doubt that if I put this list together again, even with the same 100 games, a lot of things would have changed, but I'm rather happy with what's here. And with all that, well, we've got 100 games to go through, and we should probably start doing it. Let's go. So this is certainly a game to start with. I mean, Pit Fighter isn't even that good. It's an amusing mess of a digitised fighting game with a concept and story that's hilarious. It's so cheesy. It's as if someone made a tie-in game for a direct-to-video trash flick that would take pride of place in a red-letter media video. And yet, at least in its arcade version, it's a load of utterly mindless fun where you hammer buttons, laugh at the various ridiculous characters, everyone from the fat gimp, the 80s hair metal music video girl, and the guy who's wearing nothing but chains and a fawn, and generally enjoy themselves. The home versions of the game may be bloody horrid in most cases, but the arcade is still where it's at. Soccer Brawl is the first of a good few SNK games on the list. It'd be one if they didn't have a whole bunch of entries, really. It's not exactly the most famous one or anything, but there's always something appealing about a take on football that allows you to perform ridiculous super shots and also blast people rather than boringly tackle them. It's kind of a take on their own more famous Super Sidekicks games, but the future sports editions make Soccer Brawl a fair bit more fun than those titles are for me.
Kickoff.
Now, here's one of the few cases of a microcomputer game actually coming to the arcade. Data East and Ocean had a bit of an agreement going for Robocop, meaning that Data East ended up porting Ocean's game, with a few little changes, to the arcade. An odd state of affairs, but the arcade certainly left a mark on me, being a huge Robocop fan growing up and everything. Seeing the movie is one of the first things I can remember even, so you can imagine I was all over this as soon as I started going to the arcades. The actual arcade itself is an okay enough side-scroller, although it's also an utterly gratuitous coin muncher, but hey-ho, it's Robocop, and therefore it gets a place. A few of the games in this top 100 are probably more familiar to me through their home versions than their arcade, and Renegade is definitely one of those. But even if the classic ZX Spectrum version of Renegade will always kind of feel like home, it's still a bloody good arcade, a very influential one where, originally, you played as a swishly dressed, hot-blooded high school teenager. In Japan, this was the start of the Kunio-kun series. The main guy in the Western version may have utterly lost his dress sense, but he can still throw a mean punch and kick. One of the starting points for beat-em-ups in the arcade, obviously surpassed by a good few games, but definitely plenty of fun. Here's a sweet little early arcade fighter from Taito. Great Swordsman gives you 3 attacks, high, medium and low, and 3 settings for sword fighting, fencing, kendo, and gladiatorial combat. It's a little evolution from the likes of Karate Champ and all of that, only with weapons and a little bit more forgiveness, at least until you get to the one hit and you're dead Roman stages. But being able to block with your sword and the satisfaction of timing a nice lunge makes this one rather cool indeed to this very day. As great as the NES Bionic Commando is, and it deserves tons of praise no doubt, I do believe people tend to be a bit unfair on the original arcade, which is a damn good arcade side-scroller enhanced by the ability to use a grappling hook to not just travel everywhere at blinding speed, but also boop enemies and generally push them around. The awesome soundtrack helps too, although it is even better when arranged by Tim Follin. Again, this is another one where I first played the game on a Speccy conversion, and a good one at that. This is a damn good game as well, and I really think it should get more love. Tekken 2 being at number 94 is perhaps a reflection on the series getting better and better over time, of course. It's certainly a game I loved, even if upcoming sequels kinda superseded it. Hell, the first Tekken wouldn't be too far outside the top 100. No one really talks about it at all anymore, but I certainly remember the first time I stumbled across it in the arcade and was wowed by all the lovely 3D that was going on, even more so than I was by the first Virtua fighter. There's better things to come, but all the hidden character unlocking, combo throwing, and general iron fisting is very strong in this sequel. I always enjoyed the subtle change Bonanza Brothers got in the West. These guys aren't actual robbers. No. They're ex-thieves testing out the security systems of these buildings. Yep, absolutely. Nothing sus at all about that. Whether they're actually nicking everything or not, this game's tons of fun. A little odd for the arcade, but it works while also being really nice and crisp looking. Well worth playing the arcade if you're more used to playing it in the home. Data East's game, where you definitely don't play as James Bond, and that's totally your decision depending on the code you enter at the start, is a fine example of what they do. Not necessarily the prettiest game, but a celebration of all things side-scrolling where you get on your feet, get on a bike, get in the sea, and fight against all sorts of goons and bosses who, again, totally aren't Jaws or Oddjob. It may have been a small miracle that they didn't get sued to oblivion by the Broccolis for this, but it was absolutely the best James, British secret agent game until GoldenEye came along. MK2 is obviously great, although weirdly my arcade love for the series kind of extends more to the original these days. Maybe because the computer's less of a cheating bastard in the original? No matter though, if you had friends and you didn't get told to piss off by teenagers you tried to take on like I did, MK2's a superb sequel where everything's bigger, better, and nastier. The game that confirmed Mortal Kombat as something that was here to stay and wasn't just a bloody one-hit wonder. It's fair to say that when it comes to 3D fighters, I heavily favour Namco's work over the others. Still, it would be silly for me not to mention the impact of seeing Virtua Fighter for the first time, bleary-eyed, early in the morning at Gatwick Airport, sometime in the 90s. It certainly wasn't enough to wake me up. Back then, those sprites actually looked pretty damn real. And even though you may laugh now, it's still a very good fighter indeed. Enduro Racer is the first Sega Super Scaler title on the list, and obviously it won't be the last. These machines ruled the arcades for a good while. This one here takes the almighty Hanon and sends it off-road, with the ability to wheelie and do massive jumps that avoid rocks, and hopefully don't send you flying off course and into a road sign or whatever. It's as fun and as energy pumping as most of the other big scalers. Vendetta. This is one of those beat-em-ups that stands out for a different sort of reason. Rather than being bigger and louder than everyone else, the key to Vendetta is how much there actually is that's going on, feeling like you have a whole load of different moves at your disposal, all sorts of animations and so on. If Double Dragon 3 was a game that seriously dropped the ball, and the Kombat Tribes was the game that should have been a proper sequel to Double Dragon, Vendetta, I think, oddly feels like a Double Dragon sequel made by big fans, even though it was made by Konami. It feels like it carries a lot of inspiration from Technos' titles, more so than others, and it's certainly not as big graphically as other games from 1991, but it is bloody entertaining. Saint Dragon. Another arcade game that first managed to get my attention due to a ZX Spectrum port that is actually pretty bloody decent, one of the best 128K shooters on the computer. Still, the actual arcade is great, and to me, easily the most fun of the various dragon-based shmups out there where you have to use the tail in order to block shots, and you are going to need it because this game gets majorly tough. However, it's also a little less unfair than other similar games when it comes to power-up retention after dying, and it has a thumping soundtrack. A great and very underrated game from Trade West. Donkey Kong is the first Golden Age arcade game in the top 100, and there'll be plenty more appearances from old masters, don't you worry. It's Nintendo's Smash, it's the first appearance of Mario, it's all of those things, but yeah, still excellent without taking any of the historical importance into consideration. Donkey Kong was kind of before my arcade time, so weirdly the main place I remember playing it for the first time was on a very good Amiga homebrew port back in the 90s, that I'm pretty sure was on a cover disc of some description. The same applies to a couple of other arcade classics we'll see a bit later, but Con is one of those games that usually works out okay no matter how you play it, especially when you get to hammering those barrels. One of Sega's lesser-known fighting games, The Last Bronx is one that to me is severely underrated. It's quietly one of their very best. A weapon-based fighter that tries to be a bit more grounded than a lot of other titles in the genre, with a large streak of downtrodden 90s Tokyo running through it. It's got a system that seems a bit too simplistic at first, but really gets deeper and deeper as you play the game more. Again, my preference for the weapon-based fighters leans towards Namco, but this is a damn fine title that deserves a lot more love than it tends to get, seeing as it usually gets barely any. One of the most iconic, most influential, and certainly one of the loudest of all the Golden Age games, Williams Defender is like most other Williams games, a complete assault on the senses that partly got to where it was due to the superb play, and also partly due to being the loudest bloody thing in the arcade, punching you in the face with ear-bleeding shots and kaleidoscopic explosions. Even now, over 40 years later, this game sounds like a Venetian Snares concert. There's no subtlety about these guys, and there's nothing that's not fun about bashing your head against this game's sonic and uncompromisingly brutal brick wall. Much like Robocop, Aliens is another adult movie that could be enjoyed by kids in coin-op form. Although, let's face it, the kids no doubt had seen Aliens anyway. I mean, I certainly did. This is the first of several fantastic Konami licensed tines that we're going to see, and even if Ripley may have blonde hair for whatever reason, even if the aliens have all suddenly gone a putrid shade of pink, it's a rocking and very playable side-scroller from guys who are obviously pretty bloody good at side-scrollers. It wasn't going to be long before the list got its first classic Capcom CP system beat-em-up, and the Punisher's ready to deliver here at number 82. There's no real contest in the end. These guys are the undisputed kings of the beat-em-up form, and the Punisher is a good first game to show off several of the reasons why. No matter how long a single credit ends up lasting you, you're gonna come away from this one satisfied. You've beaten the crap or shot the crap out of a whole load of bad guys, done some cool action set pieces, and you'll generally feel like you've handed out a whole lot of justice. Capcom's formula was tried and tested, their beat-em-ups didn't do an awful lot of deviating from it, and it worked every single time. Of course, side-scrolling beat-em-ups had a lot to thank this game for. IREM's Kung Fu Master was certainly one of the first to revel in the joys of punching and kicking enemies in the face. In Japan, as Spartan X, this was a simple way to feel like Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee, being that it's an odd mixture between Chan's Wheels on Meals and Lee's Game of Death. The feeling is much the same in the Western version, even if the adaptation side is a bit more hidden away. Take the goons on from all sides, be fast on the button, and avoid being hugged to death. It's the sort of simple play that never gets old. The building blocks of Sega's legendary Super Scalers went all the way back to their mechanical arcades with the likes of Monaco GP, not to mention earlier software titles like Buck Rogers and Turbo. But Hanon was the first to evolve this concept into something state-of-the-art for 1985, a game built by Yu Suzuki to outpace all other competition, particularly Namco's pole position. And it came with a full-size bike for you to lean on as well. Even if there's obviously more impressive scalar games, including ones that came out only a couple of months after the original Hanon, this is a great introduction to the sort of intense, technically impressive arcades Sega were going to put out there, with everything from the feeling of riding that bike down a track to the awesome Hiro Kawaguchi-led soundtrack that feels like proper rock music as opposed to more traditional video game tunage. We all used to love coming across arcade games in places that aren't arcades, didn't we? Chief amongst these places was usually the takeaway, and it always seemed as though Neo Geo games were the most common. Perhaps the versatility of the MVC system had a fair bit to do with that. Anyway, Aero Fighters was the game of choice in our family's favoured chippy, and when you've got 5 minutes to wait while the cod's getting fried and you've successfully pestered Dad for a spare 20p, this lovely little vertical shooter's definitely going to hit the spot. Star Wars may not have been the first licensed game in the arcades or anything like that, but it's hard to think of any other licensed title from the golden age that came close to its importance. It sure helps that it's based on the leading franchise of the day and all of that, but this Vector title excels in every way, not just as a superb rail shooter, but as everything you would pretty much want from a Star Wars experience. The big Death Star explosion, the speech samples, the stabs of music, and an iconic sit-down cabinet. Star Wars has had so many tie-ins over the years, and a whole lot of them are absolutely fantastic games, but the 1983 arcade is still one of the very best.
Rather strong, kitten.
Rampage, a game that revels in glorious, dumb simplicity. You're a gigantic, supernatural, radioactive or whatever beast. Now go forth and knock down some buildings. No one's ever going to say that this game's play is deep and involved, but it's got no interest in that. We're here to stomp across America, grab poor innocent civvies and eat them, and tear buildings asunder until the military inevitably puts a halt to proceedings, leaving you a naked and rather embarrassed man awkwardly chucked back into the real world. The designers of the game wanted to make something fun and casual where there wasn't any one way of playing the game, and it worked. This is a whole load of fun for 5 or so minutes, and that is perfect for an arcade setting. Fantasy Zone is, well, it's obviously quite a lot like Defender. It wouldn't exist if not for that game. But aside from it being a much cuter experience to the point where it's a defining game for the whole cute-em-up genre, it makes a few welcome additions to the formula. There's the shop where you can power up your ship, the generators that offer you a thermal ideal of what you still need to do in a level, and a bunch of memorable boss fights. For this, and perhaps being that little bit easier on the eyes, the adventures of the almighty Opa Opa are a bit more palatable these days, especially if you're going to play for any decent length of time. Basketball just works so well in the arcade, doesn't it? An understanding or even a liking of the sport isn't in any way required to enjoy this title, and because of that, NBA Jam kind of transcended the sport. Ultra-fast 2-on-2 action where you throw up bricks, do some spectacular dunks, listen to the dulcet tones of Tim Kitzrow, and ideally have a friend who's going to love it just as much as you, NBA Jam is a fantastic evolution of Midway's previous b-ball classic, Arch Rivals. And for a certain generation, it's always going to be one of the most memorable and best-loved arcade games of them all.
No good! Run up by 10!
I've never been too big on the shooting gallery games where you've got a big massive machine gun or anything like that, the Operation Wolves and what have you. But I do like ones where you've got a regular pistol and you need to react quick. So I had a lot of love for the Virtua Cop games, especially Virtua Cop 2. They're very cool little pieces, even if civilians are often so ridiculous in how often they'll leap out of cover just to tell you not to shoot them. I mean, why would you do that? Anywho, this quick game of gunning down perps before the circle around them goes all red and they shoot you isn't the most famous of Sega's shooters nowadays, but damn if it wasn't worth sticking a quid into at the time. Cave, masters of the bullet hell genre of shmuppage, make their first appearance with one of their few forays into the horizontal. Pro Gear is a typically beautiful game by them, with lovingly crafted sprites to go along with the very pretty and exceptionally deadly shot patterns. And, well, it's also by some distance a hell of a lot less cringy to play than Death Smiles is. I've always leaned more towards the vertical shooters as games that I prefer playing, but this is a definite gem and one of the best horizontal shmups of them all. Up next, it's Commando. You know, just to continue with the little theme of blasting everything in sight. Commando had a little misfortune back in the arcade due to SNK's Ikari Warriors kind of stealing its thunder, but this to me has always been the more fun game. A lot of this has to do with the ability to really rip through Commando if you're able to, moving like greased lightning towards the last bit of the stage, trying to get the bonus general, and feeling like a proper hero with every well-placed shot. Iconic home ports for the NES and the microcomputers also help, but the original arcade definitely gives off that one-man army Rambo type feeling. More secret agent capers abound in Rollin' Thunder, another classic from Namco. This side-scroller certainly influenced many others with its options for cover, power-ups hidden behind doors, and its lower and upper levels, but there's still plenty of love about what was back then a very original title. The oddly proportioned characters with incredibly long legs, the masker soldiers you constantly have to shoot, and the often quite clever nature of the levels themselves. It's always stood out a little bit from so many other side-scrolling shooters as a result, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Well, this is by my count the 5th game in a row which involves grabbing a gun and blasting everything in sight. I'm not trying to send out some sort of subliminal message or anything, but that is just something you do a lot in the arcades, isn't it? This one puts you back in the shoes of Alex Murphy for a sequel that's way better than the original, but unfortunately never had a home port. Robocop 2 is still a side-scroller, but it's one where you have a lot more freedom of movement, it's all a lot smoother, it's less of an irritating coin muncher, and it's also just damn fun to slam guys all over the shop when they're too close to gib with the Auto 9. This is one of the very best Robocop games, and it's quite an underrated little title. Of course, there's nothing all that underrated about Double Dragon. Technosa's beat 'em up, coming in here at the nice position of number 69, was an absolute game changer, the game that popularised and helped to create an entire massive arcade genre. The original Double Dragon, in spite of certain things like a lack of variation in enemies and a bunch of technical hiccups that do make it rather slow going at points, still has enough for it to be able to hang with other beat-em-ups that came later, especially when it comes to a whole raft of cool weapons and moves, including the stupidly overpowered elbow. Weirdly, the arcade never had an utterly worthy sequel to the original Double Dragon. The second was too similar, the third was absolute rubbish, but good sequels would certainly come out in the home. Legend of Kage is one of those games that kinda gets a mixed reception nowadays, but I personally adore Taito's game. It's a straight tribute to a whole load of classic martial arts movies. The arcade is often all about the simplest of pleasures, and when you've got a game like this where you do little but outrageously fly about and are able to throw your Death Stars at enemy ninjas in all directions, well, that's right up my alley, with a whole bunch of nicely done little scenes that always keep the action moving forward. It's just the sort of thing I'd want to play for no more than a couple of minutes, in other words. It's taken a while, but Crystal Castles is the first game on the list where the optimal way to play it is with a trackball, something that I always struggle with, but despite that there are a few trackball titles on here. Still, as fun as the game is, with all of its batting of the ball and struggle to collect the gems before either the enemies do or before they kill you, the main thing I love about the adventures of old Bentley Bear here simply is how it looks. To me, this is still one of the absolute best looking arcade games there's ever been, even if it's nearly 40 years old. There's just, I don't know, something about this heavily geometric style, something that's apparently an example of trimetric projection, if Wikipedia is to be believed. Did you ever watch MTV2 back in the late 90s or early 2000s? It feels like the guys behind that channel's aesthetic played more than their fair share of Crystal Castles. I adore it. Game's great too. When it all comes down to it, a lot of athletic games are basically track and field all over again. They're a bit more sophisticated nowadays, but in the days when the arcades were more prevalent, they were basically all about hammering those buttons or getting that perfect 45-degree angle. As much as I do enjoy games like Sega's Decathlete or indeed Namco's International 3D update of this, the original recipe's always going to be the main one that sticks out in my mind, the 1984 game that I've always loved, whether in the arcade or in the home. That is, in the home unofficially as Daley Thompson's Decathlon for the Specky. It's utterly classic fun whether you end up pumping your fists in victory or quizzically rubbing your head at your own failure. Speaking of influential games and original recipes, well, it scarcely gets more influential than this. Space Invaders needs absolutely no introduction. If this were a list based more upon importance rather than pure personal taste, obviously it would be a great deal higher. But I do have a lot of taste for the original Space Invaders, even as it gets closer to a 45th anniversary. It still manages to do a lot with very little. Just a few universally recognised alien sprites, a little spaceship to blast them with, and that relentless boop, boop, boop of their movement that gets faster and faster the more aliens you shoot down. It attracted tons of people towards it for damn good reasons, and those reasons are still very much on show in 2021. Back to Sega Scalar World for something a little different from them. Thunderblade, one of the most spectacular of the classic crop of scalers, tries to do damn near everything. Either you're flying top down and gratuitously zooming in and out as you descend and ascend, or you're in the more traditional behind the chopper view, weaving your way through shots, flying through caves, and doing various other ridiculous things. It was always too complex for home versions to get even remotely close to it at the time, and the original arcade is still one that stands up. The action you would expect from other Super Scalers is most definitely here, but oddly my favourite thing about the Thunderblade is the weirdly relaxed fusion jazzy soundtrack that isn't what you would think would soundtrack such a game, but is one of my absolute favourite scores of them all. There's a good few games I can think of from the days when I dragged my parents to arcades regularly that were always absolute must-plays, every single week. We'll undoubtedly be seeing just about all of them, but seeing as I was a big Ninja Turtles, or Hero Turtles as it was in the UK back then, fan, you can bet that the TMNT arcade was one of them. I even managed to beat it. Sort of. What happened was that a bunch of older kids happened to leave the machine right near the end. I noticed this and managed to finish the job with what they'd left behind. The memory still sticks in my mind, kind of. Anyway, this is one of Konami's legendary big 4-player beat-em-up cabinets. It's not the last one we're going to see by any stretch, and the presentation makes this just as much as the simple action that it offers. More trackball fun, and this time it's with the almighty Marble Madness. Actually, a lot of what I said about Crystal Castles can apply here too. Again, the look of this game is something that I absolutely adore, and what has always driven me towards this game as a definite favourite of mine. But there are some other things here. Mark Cerny's game has an odd atmosphere, an oddly eerie touch that you don't necessarily find in most arcade games without actually trying to be scary. I don't know, perhaps it's the music or just the Escher-esque construction, or a little bit of all of that. But this could just be not much more except carefully guiding a marble down a course, and yet it ends up being so much more. Well, here's our first Capcom fighting game, and I'm most certainly happy to put an entry from the Vampire Savior series here. Or Darkstalkers, whatever you prefer really. Obviously the technical qualities of the game hardly need much puffing up, it's a fighting game by Capcom for heaven's sake. But these games have such a great amount of character, possibly even more than big old Street Fighter 2 even. They have such a memorable roster, everyone from Morrigan to John Talbine, Felicity to my own personal favourite, cutesy psychotic bounty hunter Baby Bonnie Hood. This could be an entry for any Darkstalkers game, and in a way it is basically an entry for all of them, but Vampire Savior 2 for me is just the one that got chosen today. Here's Time Pilot. This game from Konami's early arcade years is a sprite-based and perhaps a little more Japanese take on the colossus that is asteroids, with the concept of being in a futuristic fighter jet and travelling through time, taking part in the 20th century's great air battles. Everything from mowing down biplanes to taking on contemporary jets, and eventually hitting the future. You get further points for rescuing hostages, which is ostensibly your main mission, but for the most part you're getting through the waves of bogies, dodging them and their shots in manners that are often rather daring and always satisfying. A classic Golden Age game. Ah, the cheesiness abounds once again. Can you face down the rampant ninja problems these days? Are you a bad enough dude to rescue Wonnie? Will you eventually all go for a burger? Bad Dudes is a simple game. The mechanics here may not exactly be the most sophisticated or anything like that, but this is what Data East do, and they do it very damn well. Plus it all comes with a nice bit of self-reference and a great deal of humour, whether it's battering up Karnov in the first stage or dodging enemies that have inexplicably decided to set themselves on fire. Ridiculous, yet also brilliant. It's actually quite fitting that Metal Slug immediately follows Bad Dudes. While Metal Slug is a much more sophisticated game in terms of action and mechanics and, well, just about everything, it also doesn't forget to come with lots of character and more than a little bit of humour. The brilliant designs and touches in fact just don't bloody stop with this game. There's never a dull moment where you don't have something to do or just something to enjoy looking at, and that's why it's one of SNK's very best games, not to mention one that's clearly influenced a whole load of others. An almighty evolution of the venerable side-scrolling shooter. For all that I love games like Metal Slug, or indeed cave bullet hell games that take an old genre and bring everything up a few notches, I still have tons of time for the best of the earlier titles, and when it comes to vertical shmups, that usually means Capcom's 1943. It doesn't have all the power-ups or the pretty patterns or the tiny hitboxes, but it does have action that's gonna get your face pumping out Hulk Hogan style pretty damn quick. Okay, maybe you're not actually going to do that, but it still kind of makes you feel like a dashing World War II era pilot in any case, taking on all these planes and blowing up the big boss ships on the ground. The later games in the 19XX series are also damn fine titles, but this will always be my favourite of them. Around the time I started going to arcades, Final Fight was still very much all over the place, as you might expect, but Knights of the Round was also not hard to find. I guess that's not too shocking really, but damn, this is a right good and memorable one. Grab a legendary British hero and hack your way through the sinister sounding likes of Soldier, Mask Man, Birdman and Fat Man. Occasionally you even get to go on a horse and stomp them into the ground. It's not quite Golden Axe, but still an almighty entry into the world of hack and slash beat 'em up carnage. Cave are back, and Gwanj is one of their stranger titles. More of a run and gunner, not quite Commando, but similar to, I don't know, Elemental Master on Mega Drive, if you've ever played it. The theme here is classic Japanese ghost imagery. It's all about the yokai, the onibaba, and other such things, while the bonus mechanic allows you to slow down the enemy shots a little when you hold the button and take control of your familiar. For all the complexities, the big cave head rush is as present here as it is in all of their great shooters. For something a little similar but way earlier, how about Sega Ninja? Known as Ninja Princess in Japan, this traditional run and gun, or run and throwing star I guess, takes your female ninja through various scenes on the quest for squalls and goon murder. The feudal vibes are perfectly cool and the enemy numbers are overwhelming. It's good that our ninja can disappear for a second to evade shots, something very satisfying indeed to pull off. One of Sega's best early arcade efforts, this also had a great, although oddly gender-swapped, port on the Master System. A somewhat different yet fantastic game from Taito that really should have got a home port. Dead Connection is a great take on the arena shooter in which your hard-nosed PI rolls around all over the shop, leaps off stairs, takes cover, and uses a great deal more environment than you would find in Smash TV. The whole US film noir setting helps too, as it's something you don't normally see. A fabulous game that's not just presented well, but has very sound mechanics. Taito would also put this talent for smaller yet very detailed sprites and scenes to even better use a little later on. The thing with Pan is that I could have picked any of the fricking games here. Whether it's the classic original or the beautifully inventive Mighty Pan, they'd all work. My preference, however, is for Pan 3, which has a classic art theme of sorts. It doesn't have the Buster Brothers as such, but with so many new abilities and so many different takes on the simple act of busting a load of balloons to gradual nothingness, it's great, and one of the best single-screen arcades ever. Playing it also takes me right back to an arcade in Benidorm, where I got hooked on it for the first time. Games like Pan 3 weren't necessarily in every arcade you went to, while something like Daytona USA, well, that probably was, so long as it's got enough room to fit in. This is Sega's definitive racer for a good couple of generations, those a little younger than the folks who grew up without one and all that. There's still great 3D, super fast racing and, well, obviously the soundtrack too, with those loud and passionate Takanobu Mitsuyoshi vocals. Sega were the kings of the arcade circuit for quite some time. Daytona carried that tradition to another generation when it was released, and like all the best Sega racers, it's just as brilliant today. The start of the top 50 takes us back to the golden age, and back to the brutality of Williams, by which I don't necessarily mean difficulty, I mean being full on and in your face. Sinistar has a classic gameplay loop. You fly around desperately mining Cine-bombs, stopping enemies from grabbing them and so forth, until eventually, "Beware, I live," announces the arrival of one of gaming's earliest and greatest boss figures, the titular ship. If you have enough bombs, you deposit them into his face and destroy him. If you don't, you're screwed. No other way to say it. Sinistar himself, with all his speech samples and that roar as he eats you alive, is undoubtedly what makes this game legendary, although it would still be good even without such a villain.
Beware, I live.
Capcom didn't have too much trouble making their fighters thoroughly chaotic. They did it with Street Fighter 2, making the game faster in response to various bootleg versions that did the same, and Marvel vs. Capcom kind of takes it to another level, slamming two big franchises together for some tag team fighting action, replete with amazingly high jumps and happily ridiculous super moves. It all works out pretty well even beyond the sheer fun of having Strider Hiryu go against Wolverine, or putting together a team with Spider-Man and Mega Man, and calling it, I don't know, All a Mans or whatever. It all started with the X-Men up against the folks from Street Fighter, and it only got wilder from there. But there's never a point where Marvel vs. Capcom gets too silly to be utterly playable. No matter what, it's always one of the most entertaining fighting games out there, both to play and just to dumbly gawp at. Weirdly, Gyros is another game that kind of bashes two different things together, playing like a cross between Konami's own Galaga and Tempest, with a soundtrack that's slightly inspired by the old band Sky's take on Buck's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. You go round and round on your way through the solar system, busily trying not to get killed, with ships artfully descending towards you, and a few power-ups at your disposal. It's a great mashup sort of game, and unoriginal as it may be, that soundtrack is bloody blistering. One of the arcade's great cult classics, Windjammers is a game loved by damn near everyone who plays it, often imitated, especially in recent years, but not something that's truly been repeated. Pick your athlete and then throw a disc back and forth with your opponent, trying to beat them to the punch and score some points. The action can be pretty wild, especially when you're not sure how the disc's gonna bounce, or if you decide you've got the opportunity to rush forward and take a bit of a risk in order to get the victory. Considering that each set's only 30 seconds long, it's not like you have a whole load of time. And then inevitably, in your quest to outpower your rival over the net, you get bloody caught out by the dreaded slow curling one. This slice of one-on-one sporty action just managed to get it all right, and for the time it's pretty much unique. One of the definitive Super Scaler machines, Afterburner 2 in the early 90s was one of the centerpieces of any arcade. A big sit-down machine that sent you flying and leaning about all over the shop with every move. Perhaps not as much as an R360 did, but relatively speaking, Afterburner's a neat budget option. Removed from the legendary cabinet, it's still pretty bloody good, having all the trademarks of Sega's best scaler titles. The iconic music and presentation certainly helps a lot, but it's also very exhilarating to fly around, taking down enemy warplanes and avoiding shots. It's also fun to be brash and constantly twirl around all over the place, even if more often than not doing so will get you killed. But hey, it's not like you're ever going to be able to do this in a real F-14 Tomcat, so you may as well do it here. Total carnage! Big money! Big prizes! I love it! Are just a few of the utterly inimitable phrases uttered by the host of Smash TV, the world's most popular and most violent game show where contestants risk life and limb just to win a couple of $1 million and about 1 billion or so VCRs. Eugene Jarvis's update on his own almighty Robotron 2084 adds a glorious sheen of dystopia to go along with a whole load more power-ups and enemies, and the end result is more than worthy. There's such a great flow to Smash TV, especially when you're able to smoothly move from power-up to power-up, taking out wave after wave of enemies in the process, and switching from rockets to bombs, from speed-ups to shields, all sorts. Whatever it takes in order to survive, and hopefully with the odd extra life or two here and there. Of course you'll most likely die eventually, it doesn't take much to be cornered, or to step on a mine, or to take a stray bullet. But it's always tempting to get another coin out and get right back into the fray. 10 seconds! First, there was UN Squadron, a pretty neat horizontal shooter from Capcom that came with a license in Japan. Carrier Airin, released a couple of years later, is the game's sequel, and as fun as UN Squadron is, this one's just so much better. Again, horizontal shooters aren't always my thing, but this is one of the very best of them, a classic jet fighter affair where you do ridiculous things like blow a massive gap through buildings just so you can fly through them. I'm not sure why it wouldn't just occur to our hero to try and fly around them or anything like that, but there's no time to think about such things when you've got an entire enemy army to destroy, is there? Such things like this, alongside play that's clearly done by folks at the very top of their game, makes this one of my absolute favourite non-bullet hell shooters, horizontal or vertical. This one really deserved a decent home port, and sadly it didn't get one. Daytona USA was only a few entries ago, so you can probably guess that I had a little conundrum in my head on whether to go for that game or Sega Rally as my favourite of Sega's 3D racers. In the end, Sega Rally just wins out, chiefly because it was always the one I played more of back in the day. Something about the rally setting really worked with this one, from the calls of easy right and long medium left and all that, to all the jumping around and rowing, and the tons of great feedback that came with it. Back in the mid-late 90s, this was simply a must-play whenever I came across it. And as wonderful as Takanobu Mitsuyoshi's contributions to Daytona USA are, there is perhaps no more iconic moment from the man than his simple cry at the end of each playthrough. Only Outrun 2 beats this as far as Sega's 3D racers go, and seeing as that's kind of always been a home game for me, this ends up grabbing the top Sega 3D spot.
Hey, left. Wow, medium right. Easy right, easy left.
There's a whole load of football arcade games out there, and like a lot of football games in the home, a lot of them either haven't really held up to time, or they were kind of bland from the very beginning. Only the strongest ones survive, and Football Champ is, for me by some distance, the greatest football arcade game ever. It's not that it does too much that's outrageously different from the likes of Super Sidekicks or World Cup 86 or anything like that, but the play is smooth, actually well balanced for an arcade footy title, and most importantly, it's satisfying. Chipping the keeper is always bloody great. It also has a lot of personality. It's always fun to accidentally knock down the lumbering referee so that you can quickly chuck a punch or a V-trigger the way of your opponent. It's even got the super shot, that rarest of occurrences which needs quite a few things to fall in place in order to be activated, but when it happens, that's quite awesome indeed. As far as I'm concerned, still the best footy game the arcade's ever produced. And we stick with Taito for what's surely one of their most legendary arcade efforts, Chase H.Q. Once again, personality goes a hell of a long way here. You'd expect most Taito games to be very strong when it comes to the usual stuff, and you'd be surprised if something like Chase H.Q. didn't feature solid controls and all the typical things you'd want from a good driving game. But the cool concept of chasing down a criminal's car and bashing it until it stops is one thing, and the way it's all presented is another. The frustrations of Nancy at headquarters, the whoosh of the nitro as you scream towards your target, and naturally the constant wails of your partner to bear down and push it more as you hit the perp over and over, as if he's Vince McMahon gasping at pictures of Gary Stridham. Chase HQ was fortunate enough to receive brilliant ports on machines that really didn't have much business having such good things, but the arcade is naturally still the kin.
Bear down. More. Push it more. Please. Oh, man. Bear down. More. Push it more.
Another one where the impact kinda goes without saying. The odd thing about Pac-Man is that I guess for a long time I didn't consider myself a big fan of the game or anything. It was something I respected a lot without ever playing too much. Weirdly, getting a quarter arcade of the game kind of changed that, as did learning more about the game's mechanics from folks like John Stoodley, someone who is, well, pretty bloody good at Pac-Man. It kinda goes without saying that if you're in the retro gaming space, you're gonna be around it a lot. Sort of like yuppies and cocaine, I guess. I've gradually played it more and more and gradually enjoyed it an awful lot more. I'm not even unspeakably awful at the game now. It feels odd to say that about something so famous, but I'm at a point where Pac-Man's a bit more than a huge gaming monolith now, and it's something I actively bloody enjoy. Enough to kick off the top 40, that's for sure. Sunset Riders is another one of the key games that were all over the place when I started going to the arcades, usually coming on a huge cabinet filled with massive explosions that demanded attention. I suppose that if you're around my age, this game can't help being iconic. The heart-pumping music, the lovely characters, and all sorts of famous speech samples. Everything from "bury me with my money" to "okay ma'am, we won't hurt him," which oddly is said after you've just pumped a couple of hundred or so shots into the poor sod. But hey-ho, that's the nature of arcade games, isn't it? Konami's side-scroller remains one of the most spectacular of them all, and remains one of the most easily playable and entertaining. You never forget this one after playing it even once.
Time to pay.
Cave's shooters are just getting bigger and better, and Mushihime Sama, otherwise known as Bug Princess, is second only to one other for me, which we'll be seeing a bit later. How come? What makes this one stand out? I mean, there is the general prettiness after all. This is the most recent game on the whole list, originally coming out in 2004, and as you might expect, the graphical work on this is at some freaking ludicrous level, as well as striking a right balance between good old school fantasy, a bit of anime, and of course the pretty and highly deadly patterns of shots you expect from a cave bullet hell title. And of course you get the rush of playing these games. They look ridiculously hard, although they're actually not really as hard as a lot of old school shooters I could mention, and the satisfaction of escaping the waves of bullets without dying or using a bomb is almost unmatched. Lovely title. Graphically, Galaxy Force 2 is possibly the most impressive of all the Super Scaler games. Even when you think that a lot of them were amongst the best looking thing in the arcades at the time, this one just seems to be on a whole other level for all the stuff that's going on. The huge and undoubtedly expensive cabinet obviously helped matters there too, but much like Afterburner, this game doesn't need the big cabinet to shine. It's a legendary space shooter no matter what, helped along by a cracking soundtrack that, much like Thunderblade, opts for a more jazz fusion approach that's quite appropriate for the on-screen action. Still, an absolutely wowing technical experience like this one was one of the great reasons to go to the arcade, especially for those of us who didn't have much except ZX Spectrums and C64s in the home. And oh boy did this game deliver on that front. A classic Western license tacked onto a Japanese game that doesn't really make a huge amount of sense when you think about it, although Dynamite Deca is at the very least set in a big skyscraper. Die Hard Arcade, as we knew it over here, is one of the few games that really managed to capture all the things that made old 2D beat-em-ups so good and transfer them to 3D. It's just as fun as damn near any classic of the genre you'd care to mention, it's got a good sense of humour about it, and there's so much variety in everything from the weapons to the enemies and all the different scenes that it's pretty hard to get bored with all that's going on. Even the quick time events are still satisfying. They were certainly a lot more novel when this game first arrived, that's for sure. Another legend from the Golden Age, this time from Bally Midway. Whether you play it in Budweiser or root beer form, the aim of Tapper is the same. Frantically clear a bar of the patrons descending upon you, desperate for you to quench their thirst. It's a game of damn near constant calculation. Make sure you slide the exact amount of pints down there, take note of the groups that are getting the closest, judge whether you've got enough time to grab all the glasses, see if you can get a bonus tip, even if that presents its own risk. It feels as though you're doing so much when you're playing Tapper, but it all progresses quite smoothly, even as the hordes get ever more impatient and closer to the bar, just inches from grabbing you and chucking you out, even if there are so many different ways to screw up. It's still great to hang on, and even greater if you actually do manage to empty the bar, clearing out the ones who constantly come back for multiple drinks before another wave enters. Brilliantly complex and simple at the same time, and a true arcade gem. The impact of Mortal Kombat is obviously something that's been gone through plenty of times. This game strode into the arcades and became the big thing overnight, everyone salivating at the loud action and the sight of blood. It has at times become fashionable to dismiss the whole thing as a cheap gimmick that covered a lousy game. But nah, that's bollocks. The original Mortal Kombat is a classic fighting game that has more than enough depth for anyone to be getting on with, alongside its various fatalities and little secrets. It was a defining game of my arcade years, but it's still one I happily play today. It had a satisfying feeling about it beyond the bloodshed that, well, it wasn't necessarily better than Street Fighter, it was just different, and it's something that still very much shines. Nowadays, just as back in the day, I love them both. And for all the sequels to this one, some of which are very damn good indeed, the original Mortal Kombat is still without question my favourite entry in Midway's series. They just keep getting bigger and more important now, don't they? Ed Logg's seminal game for Atari took the classic dungeon crawler and made it an arcade game. It's a maze, but now it's top down. Now it's fast. Oh, and there's about 100 or so different monsters pouring out of generators each and every second, so, have fun and all that. Death is kind of inevitable in Gauntlet no matter what you do. You can't keep your health topped off forever without using money, after all. But for all the arcade trappings, it still has the feeling of taking a bit of an adventure, and it makes you want to keep going and going to see if this descent into the depths actually does have a finishing point. Oh, and the speech samples, obviously. It seems that for arcades more than anything else, things like that do go a long way. It is all about the attraction, after all. It's been around about 25 years since Point Blank first came to my attention, and ever since then it doesn't feel like there's been any time when the game doesn't grab everyone's attention. It's the perfect mix of shooting gallery goodness and a casual party atmosphere, something for everyone to play that's quite a bit different from the more intense light gun titles that were also going about at the time. The appeal's just always going to be there. Even now, whenever I go to any expo or event like that, if there's a Point Blank machine, you can bet that there's going to be a big queue for it from the very start of the show right up to kicking out time on Sunday. Namco had both the more serious and the lighter side of light gun games down utterly pat at this time, and this is the one that absolutely everyone loves for bloody good reason. Right here, just before the top 30, comes the first proper Street Fighter game, and it's Alpha 3, which has always been my definite go-to of the Alpha games. Naturally, having a big old roster and neatly collating all the different ways to play the title in one neat package helps with that, as well as the graphical fidelity and all those other nice things. But I suppose really that the Alpha game anyone would choose, more than anything, comes down to whichever one was the most easily available to play at the time. And for me that was always Alpha 3. I mean, it is a Street Fighter game after all. It's pretty assuredly going to be bloody excellent. It's just that this one has the option of everything, from Dan to Dalsim and Birdie to Relento. The simplicities of the Golden Age in many ways aren't actually simplicities at all. They're games that may look very simple indeed, but actually have plenty going on under the hood to help with the player's general aim of setting as high a score as possible and sticking their initials on the top. Tekken's Bomb Jack, at first glance, looks like a game where you just jump all over the place and grab the bombs on the screen. But when you get into the multipliers, the bonuses, the knowledge of triggering them, all the power-ups or what have you, when you see it played well, it's like there's a whole bloody science to the art of grabbing these bombs in a perfect sequence. But of course the other beautiful side of it all is that you don't need to know about any of that to have a good time, and I can safely say that this is one of the most addictive and flat out greatest games of the entire Golden Age period. Was this my first ever Sega game? Proper one that is, not just a conversion to the Spectrum? It's possible that it was. It's either this or another game that we're going to see in a little bit, but Golden Axe is certainly a big part of my very first arcade. It's all a bit hazy, I was pretty bloody young after all, but there is a vivid picture, perhaps a jumble of memories, of the first time my parents took me into an arcade and this game being the first one that captured my attention, the first that caused me to tug on my dad's arm and ask him for 10p. Obviously it wasn't disappointing. 30 years later, Golden Axe is a definitive hack and slash beat 'em up, and a game I know inside and out, one that I've played to death both here in the arcade and on its excellent Mega Drive conversion. It's probably not a game I have to justify the placing of. We've seen a good few beat 'em ups, we've explained their appeal, and Golden Axe excels in every department. But the memories here are also a big part of what makes this utterly important to me. Every time we've pulled from the Williams well, we've talked about how these games tend to just beat you about the head with the loudest colours and sounds possible. The best way to attract customers, in their eyes, was clearly through an appealing form of physical assault. Robotron 2084 is perhaps the best example of this, while also being one of their best games beyond all the intoxicating shit that's happening. This is Eugene Jarvis after all, and it's his original arena shooter that would inspire so much that came after, by himself and also by other people. The one where you save the last human family. That is, if you get to them through the waves of bad guys who are going to kill you in seconds flat if you don't control them. It has a certain vibe that a few Golden Age games have, a touch of darkness, a wonder at why these folks are the last human family. But putting the wank hat on and contemplating whether Robotron was a game made by folks who didn't think the human race had too many days left for whatever reason, doesn't affect the core of the game and how it is so freaking good. And well, here's something different. Again, it's the Super Scalers, and alongside another game we'll be seeing soon enough, this is probably the most important and best known Sega scaler of them all. The one where you get in a Ferrari and you just go ahead and drive. Mind you, there is a time limit, and you probably want to go pretty bloody quickly if you fancy reaching the end of the course. The romanticism of Outrun and Yu Suzuki's claims of wanting to create a game that was about driving and not racing are perhaps not so apparent when you're bobbing and weaving through traffic at top speed while trying desperately not to smash into roadside buildings, but the beauty of the game is most certainly always there. A whole lot of love, a whole lot of good music, and perhaps a little sense of letting the wind blow back your hair with the love of your life by your side. You probably shouldn't drive so fast in real life, mind you, as you will very probably be arrested. Once again, we go from light, bright and vibrant to a game that is, well, basically a bloody void. I'm not sure if there's any more sudden graphical shift in this top 100 than the one that takes us from Outrun to Asteroids, one of the vectorkins of the Golden Age, and a game that's just, well, lines. Lines and lines and lines, usually forming the shape of rocks you need to break apart. It's that simple. In fact, Asteroids is exactly like real life. You wheel around confused and end up doing little except break rocks until you inevitably die. Screw the aspirational nature of Outrun, this is reality. Okay, I'm clearly talking absolute bollocks here. This is just a simple game of survival, after all. But all these years later, it's still one of the best. Still one where careful flying and just scraping past these lethal space boulders is exciting and stimulating, and clearing a wave makes you damn happy. For a couple of seconds until the next one comes along, and then it's back to it. The grindstone never felt so good. Strider will never not be a game near and dear to me. I've talked about it endlessly in the past and will happily do so again. This hacking side-scroller has to take some sort of prize for endless scenes and set pieces. Boss fight after boss fight, the anti-grav section, jumping from chopper to chopper, the one where you race down an exploding slope and make that big jump. It just doesn't stop. For me, that's kind of a lot of things I enjoy about a good arcade game, or just a good game in general. If someone asked me what my preferred sort of game was, I could easily just point to this one right here. Soul Calibur is more famous today, but weirdly, something about the original has always made it my favourite. I could talk about the dirtier mid-90s vintage aesthetic and all that, but that's not really it. It's more to do with holidays in Clacton, where I probably spent at least half of my time in the arcade on the Caravan site playing Soul Edge. It's not like there was a whole lot else to do, to be honest. I wouldn't argue with anyone who said that the sequels are better and more complete games, but this is the one that I played endlessly. If the arcade had the Edge of Soul from the PS1 version, it'd be even higher. Final Fight gets a nod over Strider in this list, whereas it didn't once before. For all its greatness, Strider is more comfy in the home, the Mega Drive specifically. Final Fight? Yeah, this is an arcade game. Plenty of ports of course, but they rarely nailed it. Final Fight was still absolutely everywhere when I first started going to arcades, almost as ubiquitous as the newer fighting game Capcom had released in fact. You couldn't do a run through the Seafront's arcades without playing it at least once and having tons of fun. It was the biggest leap forward in beat 'em up since Double Dragon, it inspired so many others going forward, and wrote a blueprint for Capcom that'd last nearly a decade. Not bad achievements when you think about it. A similarly ubiquitous title, this one. An arcade just didn't feel complete if it didn't have Joe Masashi's eyes peering emotionlessly at you from this game's attract mode. But this was, for me, the arcade game at the end of the street. It was in a little video rental store, and I soon got hooked, wanting my dad to take me down there every night just to play Shinobi. I can't remember actually renting any videos from there, I have to say. It did kind of close down after a short while. This was, I am pretty sure, my first arcade game. It's still one of the very best today, every bit as good as it was the first time, and a definitive side-scroller. But there might not even be a top 100 without it. The venerable side-scrollers of old like Shinobi did soon get a glow-up, of course. We've seen that with Metal Slug, and Elevator Action Returns for me is another prime example. You take a famous old arcade that's kind of dull in all honesty, use a similar miniature graphics style to Dead Connection that we saw previously, and this masterpiece as a result. Overused word? Sure, but Returns is very hard to find any sort of fault in, and filled with wonderful ideas. Sometimes it's very much worth taking something that's a little past its sell-by date and giving it a new lease of life. Top 20 time, and I hope you've got your buzzard handy. The very best of Williams' arcade games isn't quite as full-on as the likes of Defender, Robotron, or even Sinistar, but Joust is damn near unique. It's so bloody simple. All you need is careful button pressing so that you can get the higher ground and knock your opponent's block off, collecting their eggs along the way. As a concept and game, it's genius, and possibly the most addictive game in the entire list. I have spent hours playing Joust, not even recognising the time that's flying by, because it's such a pure gameplay experience that you constantly want more of. Considering that arcade enjoyment's usually measured in minutes, that's not bad, is it? Much like the last game, Bubble Bobble is another work of simple and uncomplicated brilliance where everything you do is highly satisfying. You trap enemies in bubbles and then, hopefully, you burst them all at once, leaving a whole bunch of fruit and various other trinkets as your reward, while one of gaming's greatest earworm soundtracks plays constantly in the background. It's a game that works anywhere, gradually gets more complicated as it goes on, and is a game that, well, kinda just knows how good it is, really. It's destined to be a game that sticks with you no matter where you play it for the first time, and no matter when you play it. I've been occasionally hitting up Bubble Bobble for the last 30 years, and it still feels as fresh and as glorious as the very first time. I have a strong memory of the first time I came across Time Crisis in the arcade. This huge screen cabinet with a single gun. Not something I'd never seen before, but then you also had the addition of a foot pedal. There wasn't all that much like it, and it was a curious thing. Playing it for the first time and realising that you use the foot pedal for taking cover, that's a game changer. Whereas most shooting galleries do end up feeling like shooting galleries, no matter how they're dressed up, this one felt like a proper shootout from an action movie, while also having all the necessary building blocks of a light gun game. The regular goons who'll usually miss you, the red ones you've got to take out sharpish, the various environmental hazards, bonus opportunities, and of course, the race against the clock. It was a brilliant must-play game then, and it most certainly still is now. Thanks to getting satellite rather early on, I was familiar with The Simpsons before coming across the arcade for the first time, so as you can imagine I couldn't get to the machine fast enough when I first saw it. In fact, I don't think I ever took a single trip to the arcade back in the early 90s where I didn't play The Simpsons game. I'm pretty sure I still remember exactly where it was, right near the windows in the Sunspot Amusements. It's a Konami beat-em-up where the controls are simple even when compared to something like Final Fight, but the presentation and character means none of that really matters. You're too busy picking out all the great characters, especially in a game that came out when the show itself was still in its infancy. It's not quite Konami's top game on this list, but it's not far off due to the huge impact it had on me, and it's criminal that it barely made it into people's homes. Mind you, the rather late and obscure C64 port of the game is far better than it had any right to be. House of the Dead 2 just, and I really do mean just, beats out Time Crisis to be the list's top light gun game. It was a close call. House of the Dead 2 may not have some of the more advanced mechanics that Time Crisis possesses, but this game was even more addicting. It's odd. The first one didn't make all that much of an impression on me, but everything was just bigger and better in the second, and it absolutely stuck. We took a holiday to the sunny resort of Calpe in Spain. House of the Dead 2 was in the local arcade, and I just fell in love with it. I must have spent half of the holiday playing the damn thing. Who cares about the beach when there's zombies to shoot and cheesy plots to enjoy? Ugh. Holidays abroad? They may be tricky to come by these days, but I would happily take a fortnight's quarantine if House of the Dead 2 was readily available. The top 15 starts with a game that is desperately underrated. It never feels like anyone talks nearly enough about Flicky, and it's one of my favourite arcades of all time. Once again, it's nothing all that complex. You play as a big bird, you grab chicks who follow you in a big line and take them to the exit while avoiding cats and other ne'er-do-wells, and also throwing the occasional object at them. It is a bit odd in how skiddy the whole thing is, with Flicky jumping around in a way that's quite tricky to get used to at first, but once you do it feels so nice, and it's great to bounce around with Flicky, to do stuff with style, and to perform perfectly timed jumps that not only send Flicky over the enemy, but the whole line of chicks following you too. Because Lord knows it's easy to screw up, to have the cat take out part of your line, and for the whole carefully planned route you've got going through a stage to go utterly bloody wrong. This little bird is probably more famous for his cameos in Sonic games these days, alas, but his own game is absolutely blinding. It feels like it's been a while since we've seen a Data East game, but here is their most famous game of them all, and indeed their best. Aside from having the only infectious arcade earworm that can seriously compete with Bubble Bobble, Burger Time is a glorious affair of carefully manipulating the various evil non-burger related items who want Peter Pepper's blood, hopefully crushing them under a bit of burger that you've stomped on and sent falling to the next level, and using whatever tools you have at your disposal to help you construct a good burger. Albeit one that has lots of tiny little footsteps over it. It's got the maniacal action you'd expect from a good Golden Age single-screen title, it's got tons of charm too, and hey, it is food, so naturally I'm going to have a bit of bias towards it. It's a bloody good burger. I've already stated my love for Tekken, and this one here is absolutely my Tekken of choice. For me, it's still the peak of the series. Of course, the only real reason for this is because it's the Tekken I played the most. The series has always been good, and the most recent one, Tekken 7, is a fantastic game indeed. But you always go back to your one, don't you? It helps also that Tekken 3 is the one that introduced a lot of crucial mechanics that would play a big part in the series going forward, the sidesteps and what have you. Whether it was in the arcade or on the PS1, there just wasn't anything that could touch Tekken 3, certainly not when it came to 3D fighting titles, and the whole community aspect of the fighting really helped its cause as well. The race to unlock all the various characters, the ever familiar crowds hanging around all the machines. It really is everything a fighting game should be, as far as I'm concerned.
Round one.
Some people tend to treat Alien Syndrome like a bit of an also-ran, an arcade game from Sega that's not necessarily as technically impressive as their most typical smashers, but there's something different about this, something that makes it stand out. Tension isn't something you often experience with arcades, something a bit different from the usual rush of adrenaline you tend to get from them. But Alien Syndrome, with its rather muted colours, eerie atmosphere, and pumping heartbeat music, is kinda designed to make you be a little on edge, even in an arcade setting. The ever-present timer and blood-curdling scream when the aliens catch up with you certainly doesn't calm anything down either. All of this is wrapped up in a simple top-down shooter that wants you to be urgent, but will throw tons of aliens at you to keep you constantly reacting and ever more on edge. It's not all that far removed from something as old school as a Berserk or a game along those lines, but the whole package itself, it's one of the best, and every time I play it, it seems to leave even more of a mark.
Go to the exit.
Just outside the top 10, we have the golden game that for many is the best to never make it out of the arcade. The almighty Golden Axe had a bunch of sequels, mostly in the home, that were kind of variable in quality, but this one in the arcade was a total home run. With one very hefty exception, for many arcade players it is the perfect sequel. The Revenge of Death Adder takes the original and improves absolutely everything, not just the obvious things like exceptional graphics and bigger effects and all a lot, but gameplay that's been entirely reworked, is much greater in depth, especially if you've got more than one person playing, and hundreds of different little touches to give the game as much impact as possible. As excellent as the original Golden Axe is, the Revenge of Death Adder knocks it into a cocked hat, And even if it never had the increased exposure of a home version, the sheer quality of the game has taken it to a state now where it is considered amongst the best arcades of them all, good enough for revivals, re-releases, and endless gushing. I can do little except add my own appreciation to the gush, for it is a next level title that is rather unfortunate not to make the top 10. That said, the top 10 is pretty bloody good. We just talked a little about tension and a darker sort of arcade game with Alien Syndrome, but the darkest arcade game of them all has never been in question. It has always been, and always will be, Missile Command. Nothing else comes close. The game where, from the beginning, you're essentially dead, and so is everyone else. You're the last line of defense, desperately fighting off nukes and protecting these cities from annihilation for as long as you can, but kill screen aside, there's never a point where they're going to stop coming. If you lose and you haven't set a high score, the gigantic explosion and the words "the end" as opposed to "game over" leave little doubt as to what's happened. The end of civilization. It's the perfect Cold War game, and the aura of what Dave Furrell was busily crunching away at creating was enough to give him severe night terrors for a long time afterwards, constant dreams of seeing missiles black out the skies over San Luis Obispo. If you play this game for long enough, you might end up the same way. A priceless artifact not just of the golden age of arcade gaming, but of an entire precarious period of human history. It deserves to be considered one of the most important games ever released. It's time to hunt. We've already seen a few great Capcom beat-em-ups, but there's two for me that stand out over everyone else. And even beyond the sheer joy of being able to play as the Predator and lay waste to thousands of aliens in the most glorious of crossovers, Alien vs Predator is a beautifully made example of the genre. The Predators have so many great moves at their disposal. Dashers, uppercuts, discs from hell, all sorts of brutality with their claws and naginata, and obviously the signature shoulder cannon, especially good when you get hold of the Super magazine and get to go absolutely postal for a few seconds. AVP does away with a bunch of the old trappings of beat-em-ups, special moves costing you a bit of energy and so on, and gives you a lot more freedom to do any move at any time, with the counterbalance being that you have to face so many more enemies, and the end result just feels so much better. I'm sure all of what I've said applies to playing the game as Dutch or Kuwasara too, but all of this excellent beat-em-up construction, plus you get to play as the Predator, this is one of the absolute best in the entire field. Well, here's Street Fighter 2. Mind you, we are going to be seeing Street Fighter 2 twice. There's far too much to say about it to just fit into one entry, quite frankly. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is, of course, the ideal closing point for the title, or at least it was for many years. All the graphical upgrades, all the new challenges, plus the addition of supremely fast speed that Capcom were persuaded to stick in thanks to the various bootlegs of the original SF2. It's still one of the premier fighting games on the circuit to this very day, but that's not just simply to do with the huge success and popularity of the game, it's because very little has managed to come along that could conceivably better it. Even at the time when this came out and people were starting to get a bit of public fatigue about all the many different versions of Street Fighter 2 that Capcom were putting out there, you just had to stand in awe of this one. No matter what it was that you loved about Street Fighter 2, this one catered for it all, as well as being the first of the games to feature the almighty super combos, the first to feature Akuma, the first to have air combos, and so many other things that would continue to define the series after it finally moved past the second installment. Not only is it still important to this day, it's hard to conceive of a time when the game isn't going to remain an active concern in the fighting game world. And here's my favourite Capcom beat-em-up. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs may not be quite as deep a beat-em-up as Alien vs Predator, and it may not give you the option of playing as the Predator, but this game for me was a case of love at first sight. It still represents Capcom at the very height of their powers. You do still get a load of moves, and you also get an absolute cackload of weaponry to use against the various goons, not to mention the little sequences when dinos can join in the fray either for or against you. But this was a right special one, to me and an old friend. We didn't know anything about the original Cadillacs and Dinosaurs license, and frankly I still don't, but this is one of the very few arcade games that I managed to beat legitimately, with his help and with a whole load of 20p's. It got to the point where I would go to the arcades just to play Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. Memories like that are a bit special and form a big part of why this is my favourite Capcom beat-em-up, but even if it wasn't for that, I think it would still be up there as one of the very best games in a genre the studio had absolutely mastered. It's too fantastic not to be, really. That first experience with a bullet hell game sure is something else. I'd certainly recommend it if you haven't done it. If you thought that these games with the massive loads of shots going about everywhere are clearly far too hard to be casually played or anything like that, it's most certainly worth it. Anyway, Dodonpachi is where my first experience came from, probably where quite a few people's experience came from, seeing as it's one of Cave's first and most famous shmups, and the thing about these games is that they give you adrenaline like no other. It seems like the amount of bullets on screen are insurmountable until you realise that only a couple of pixels on your ship are going to be affected by them, and from there you gradually get through the waves of bullets more and more, and it just feels fantastic. If you play it on arcade, it puts you up on your tiptoes. If you put it on MAME, it'll make sure you're standing up soon enough. The ability to string ludicrous hit strings and combos helps too, and makes the whole thing truly next level. And before you know it, you want to have a look at damn near every bullet hell that's around. I've played a good few in my time, it has to be said, but as the first of them and a game I've played a ton since, Dodonpachi will always be the best of the lot for me. The top 5 starts with, something outrageous. How can this even be? Not only is this a sports game in the top 5, but it's a golf game in the top 5. Golf! Frickin' golf! Some of you might be going absolutely spare at such a notion, but Nazca's Neo Turf Masters transcends a sport that normally features little except middle-aged men pottering about freshly cut grass in their +4s. In Neo Turf Masters, golf is recast as the breeziest, most exciting and most welcoming thing in the world, and all it needs is a simple power bar system, one of gaming's catchiest soundtracks, a whole load of iconic sound samples, and some of the prettiest 2D graphics you're likely to find. To be honest, there is something intangible about it all. You can look at other games the guys who made this created, the earlier likes of Major Title, and see a pretty good golf game for the arcades, but it's a big jump to this, one of the loveliest and most beaming of arcade games. Playing Neo Turf Masters is just going to put a big smile on your face, it's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter what you think of golf, it's going to do it anyway. One of the best sports games ever.
Contest. Good luck. Player 1, be shot.
In at number 4, we have the champion of the golden age, the king of the old school arcade games. This time around at least, it's Galaga. On another day, in a different mood perhaps, it could have been Missile Command, or Joust, or whatever, occupying such lofty heights, but Galaga, in the end, ends up this high. It just gets better and better over time. Once again, a core to arcade is to thank for all of this. The game sure does shine in a slightly more miniature form, but when you're giving such things a proper road test, and Galaga's already one of your big favourites, you just really start thinking more and more about why the game is special to you and why it works so damn well. I suppose you could think about silly things like the pretty patterns in all the bullet hell games that I've talked about, then look at this game and see that it's kind of the originator for such things. You could think about the general simplicity of Golden Age arcade titles that's mixed with a hidden depth, and see that Galaga is a shining example of that. You could think about how it does so much with a simple bit of space, a few ships, some iconic sound effects, and some more subtle wubs and dubs in the distance. It's all there, and I think it's the most fitting choice for a single game that could represent the arcade's golden age. That's as high as the praise can get, really, and Galaga deserves the whole lot of it. Another burning question before we get to the inevitable top two, which you're probably wondering what the order of is going to be by now. What's the top Sega game? And, well, of course it's Space Harrier. If you know me and my work, there probably wasn't a great deal of suspense there. It's always been my favourite Sega arcade by a considerable distance. There's the scalar side of things, of course, which is a big part of why it's such a wonder, not just because of the technical aspects, but due to the wonderful things they did with it, creating a fantasy zone filled with big creatures, dragons, and various other obstacles rather than the more typical space setting or open road. All of this makes it a wonderfully inventive take on the shoot-'em-up, of course, all the action you'd expect from something top-down or horizontal, but in a totally different viewpoint. Then there's the music, which to me is still my favourite of all the brilliant full-song soundtracks that the SST and Hiro Kawaguchi put together, being such a triumphant little piece. Stick it all into a wonderful machine and add this still being one of the big attractions in the times when I first started going to the arcades. It's a very, very special game for me, and it's an easy choice for me to make as the best thing Sega ever put in the arcades.
You're doing great. Get ready.
Well, you might have expected this. Street Fighter 2 is at number 2, because why not have a little bit of a surprise? I mean, I certainly wouldn't argue with anyone who'd put it as number 1, or who thinks that it should be number 1, or who thinks that I'm absolutely stark raving bonkers to not put it at number 1. This is pretty much an entry for both World Warrior and Champion Edition, as they were both very much in the arcades by the time I got to them, and for all the other wondrous games that were in those arcades at the time, Street Fighter 2 was the absolute king. It was in every single arcade, and there was usually a queue, the one game that everyone was talking about and everyone wanted to have a go at, whether it was against the computer or against each other, whether they were friends or complete strangers. A lot of people no doubt have similar experiences because it was a game that did kind of change everything. There'd been plenty of one-on-one fighting games before Street Fighter 2, including the rather middling original game it spawned from, but none of them were even remotely close, to the point where they may as well have been an entirely different genre. Its impact on me and people of my generation can still be seen all over the shop, both in gaming and outside of it, and to call it the best arcade cabinet ever would hardly be incorrect. Even for all of its importance, playing the game in all of its various incarnations is still special, still something that comes as second nature, still a big part of my gaming history. It's Street Fighter 2, and in many ways that's enough said. But in a list that does admittedly rely a lot on great memories and big sentimentality, it would feel wrong to put anything other than WWF WrestleFest at number 1. Even if it can't hope to compare to the runner-up's historical importance, this really wasn't in any doubt at all. In the end, the choice really came down to this. With the limited space that I have, if I had the choice of just one arcade cabinet that I could put in my home, an original one, which would it be? And the answer would always be, without hesitation, WWF WrestleFest. It is after all something that rather neatly combined all the things I was massively into at that time. Going to the arcade, playing video games, and wrestling. The perfect game at the perfect time. Of course, it is an absolute banner of a video game. Technosa's title is a hefty improvement over previous efforts like Mania and WWF Superstars, complete with a bunch of the day's biggest grapplers and a roster that rolls right off the tongue. Hogan, Warrior, $1 Million Man, Jake the Snake, Big Boss Man, Mr. Perfect, Earthquake, Sergeant Slaughter, Demolition, and the Legion of Doom. They're all represented so well, complete with their signature moves, so wonderfully crafted in 2D to a level that pretty much no modern WWE game could ever dream of getting near. The crunch of the DDT, the posing of the big leg drop, the earthquake splash stroke giant whoopsie, the oh my god he's dead of the LOD's Doomsday device. You've got the two different ways to play, the speedy Royal Rumble for those who want a quick blast, and the main tag mode for anyone who wants to settle in for the long haul and reach a final battle with the dominant and unplayable Legion of Doom. And of course you've got all sorts of little details, the cutaways to Mean Gene interviewing the LOD, the one match that's in a cage, the snacking on danger and dining on death. More than any other game, every single little tidbit of this is written in my heart. So yeah, it's a magnificent game, and even without all the sentimentality, it would still very easily make the top 5. But all the memories attached to this game can't be ignored. I've played it every single place I've managed to find it, as a child and as an adult, for 30 years, and every time it is still the most satisfying experience. The sentimentality that often comes with a long-time wrestling fan also only gets stronger as the years go by. Especially when one considers that of the original 12 guys who made up WrestleFest's roster, only 5 are alive today. Warrior, Bossman, Perfect, Earthquake, Crusher, Demolition, and both Animal and Hawk are now all gone. That's the slightly sad side of it all. But WrestleFest immortalises them all in many ways. They're always going to be as lively as hell right here. It's the perfect representation of my time going to the arcades, my time being a wrestling fan, and well, my time finding the great things that I love to this very day, really. There could be no other choice for me as the #1 game. And with that, hopefully you've enjoyed this big old top 100, and you're going to go off and play some classic arcade games for yourself. Whether it's a typical call-up, a long-awaited revisit, or for the very first time, whether it's on an actual machine or on MAME, it doesn't matter really. They're special things, no matter what. Bye for now.